last Saturday, the Prime Minister making a statement at his PNM political meeting, which of course he's entitled to say what he wants at his political meetings, but he's not entitled to issue falsehoods, which then get conveyed to the entire people of Trinidad and Tobago and the wider world, as if what he said was gospel and true, when in fact, what he said was not true. And so I, having the involvement directly in a number of matters with respect to the whole issue of the closure of Petrotrin, I wish to clarify for you, the public, and make very clear the situation that happened with facts and details, rather than allow the falsehoods by the Prime Minister to remain out there for the public record. So Dr. Rowley, in his address on Saturday last, indicated that there were 2 union representatives reviewing Petrotrin, and that as soon as they found out that hard decisions would have to be made, they ran. Now, he did not indicate who those officials were. And so I want to say that I was one of the 2 persons nominated by the Oilfields Workers Trade Union to serve on the Petrotrin Review Committee, and the other, of course, was Mr. Gregory Marchand. And I want to indicate categorically falsehood number 1 by the Prime Minister. I did not run from the work of the committee. And so let me give you some very clear timelines. On Monday, January 30th, at the invitation of Dr. Rowley, 2017, Monday, January 30th, 2017, at the invitation of Dr. Rowley as Prime Minister, I met with him and Minister Stuart Young at the Diplomatic Center. And at that meeting, he indicated that Petrotrin was in difficulty, and he wanted to get my views on whether or not the union would be open to meeting with him and working towards a resolution of the problems at Petrotrin. And I indicated very clearly to him that I was certain that the union would want to meet with him, and that the union would participate in a process that would ensure the issues and problems at Petrotrin could get resolved, because the union had been for many years making statements about problems at Petrotrin. So this was Monday, January 30th, 2017. Monday rather, February 13th. So Monday, February 13th, 2 weeks afterwards, 2017, the OWQ's executive team, led by its President General, met with the Prime Minister. I was also present. This was at the Prime Minister's office now, St. Clair Avenue. And at that meeting, there was a very important exchange. The Prime Minister spoke. The union made a presentation on many of the issues that it had been speaking to with respect to problems at Petrotrin, and identified some of the ways forward. The Prime Minister asked the union at that meeting whether it would agree to nominate persons to serve on a committee to review Petrotrin, and the union agreed. Subsequent to that, by cabinet decision, and I'm going to refer to the review committee's report because I have with me that report of the review committee. So I'm just going to quote so that we have it absolutely clear. By Cabinet Minute 365 of February 23rd, 2017, Cabinet agreed to the appointment of a team to conduct a review of the operations of the Petroleum Company of Trinidad and Tobago and make recommendations for its restructuring. I was a member of that committee, which was chaired by Mr. Selwyn Lashley, then Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries. And so the report became popularly known as the Lashley Committee. So that was set up, and we started meeting just after the 23rd of February, and we completed our work because we were given a mandate to complete our work by the 1st of June. And in fact, we finished our report. The report is dated 1st June 2017. And both myself and Mr. Marchand participated in the work of that committee right up to its very end. The committee then presented its report to the Prime Minister at the Office of the Prime Minister in St. Clair on the 6th of June 2017. 6th of June. Now, at that meeting, apart from the chair, who was Mr. Lashley, the only two members of the committee present were Mr. Marchand and myself. So the ODBQ's representatives followed up and participated in the work of this committee right up to the end, including the fact that we were the ones who presented on behalf of the entire committee the report to the Prime Minister. And I spoke about the recommendations and indicated to the Prime Minister the thinking of the committee as articulated in our recommendations. We were then, the Prime Minister then suggested that the committee meet with the Energy Subcommittee of Cabinet so that a wider cross-section of key decision makers, including himself, who as Prime Minister chairs the Energy Subcommittee, and other senior ministers of the government, together with the chairpersons of various state companies in the energy sector, NGC, Petrotrade, TNTech, among them, that they are also members of the Energy Subcommittee of Cabinet. And so that meeting was set up for June the 21st. So on June 6th, I met with the Prime Minister together with Mr. Marchand, also ODBQ's representative, and the chair of the committee, Mr. Lashley. On the 21st of June, there were three members of the committee, myself, Mr. Marchand, Mrs. Drayton, and then the chair, Mr. Lashley, but Mr. Lashley was wearing two hats. One as chair of the committee, but as permanent secretary of the Ministry of Energy, he was a member, a substantive member of the Energy Subcommittee. The other three members of the committee, Mrs. Drayton, myself, and Mr. Marchand, were kept waiting for 2 hours in the lobby of the Office of the Prime Minister. And then when we were eventually invited in, Mrs. Drayton had to leave just prior to that because she had another commitment, not expecting that this would have taken so long. Mr. Marchand and myself met with the Energy Subcommittee, but we met for only a very short period of time, no more than 10 minutes or so, because that day there was big major flooding in South Trinidad, and the Prime Minister wanted to visit South Trinidad. Remember, there was a storm that hit Trinidad on the evening of June 19th into June 20th, and there was significant flooding, and the Prime Minister indicated on the 21st of June, which is when we met with the Energy Subcommittee, that he had to leave to go down to view some of the communities that had been affected by flooding. And so we only had a very short discussion, that is myself and Mr. Marchand, with the Energy Subcommittee. However, it was clear that Mr. Lashley, as chairman, presented the report on his own behalf, must be, because he didn't report on behalf of all of us, because we were excluded from that process. He presented the report to the Energy Subcommittee, and they discussed it. They discussed it in the absence of myself and Mr. Marchand and Mrs. Drayton, who had been waiting for several hours. So that is what happened on the 21st of June. But up to then, we were very much part of the process, very much part of the process. So we never ran at all. So that was a falsehood by the Prime Minister. What I can say is that on the 29th of August, the evening of the 29th of August, 2017, the Prime Minister communicated with me and invited me to serve on a reconstituted board of Petrotrade. And I responded by saying I would have to give it some thought. I asked him whether or not the reconstituted board would be done consistent with the recommendations of the Lashley Committee, of which I was a member. Because you see, and we made this public in 2018, and even perhaps before that, but it is in this country's culture that we often forget the facts. So let me just indicate what the recommendations of the Lashley Committee were, because we only made 2 recommendations. One recommendation, which was on page 33 of the report, one recommendation was respect to governance arrangements. Because, and we said this, the team proposes the following 2 recommendations. The 2 we firmly believe are the strategic decisions which must be taken to ensure that subsequently the company implements the appropriate technical, financial, and management actions necessary for it to become a sustainable, profitable entity that pays taxes, meets the HSE standards of the nation, pays dividends, and earns significant foreign exchange, quote, end of quote. And the 2 recommendations were: 1, governance arrangements. We said to enable the company to have a consistent, focused mandate, facilitate long-term planning, and avoid the frequent changes in board and management. We recommend A, the members of the board are selected through a process which provides for comprehensive and transparent input and feedback from key stakeholders to ensure that members possess the relevant experience and capabilities to address priority matters critical to the transformation and sustainable development of the company. And that Petrotrin adopts a policy whereby the board of directors' terms of office are cycled in such a manner to ensure that at all times there is continuity of membership of at least 50% of the board. That is what we recommended. So I asked the Prime Minister, is my proposed appointment going to be consistent with this governance arrangement, which I was part of recommending as a member of the Lashley Committee? In other words, that the members are selected through a process which provides for comprehensive and transparent input and feedback from key stakeholders. And the Prime Minister could not answer that with a simple yes. And therefore, I indicated to him the following morning, the morning of the 30th of August, that I would, while I was honored to have been considered, I would respectfully decline, because I could not accept a board appointment that was being done in a manner inconsistent with the principal recommendation, the main recommendation of the committee of which I was a member, which was crucial for the success of Petrotrin going forward. And therefore, I did not run from any responsibility. I maintained a principal position that I could not accept a board appointment that was inconsistent with the recommendation of a committee of which I myself was a member. Espinay had no such qualms, and he ended up serving on the board, and Lashley also had no such qualms, and he ended up serving on the board, and so on. So that is falsehood number 1, which I have dealt with. I did not run from any responsibility. And let me just say that I have taken up very many public service appointments and so on, and responsibilities in Trinidad and Tobago. Many of you may not be aware, but I served on the board of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, the board of the Environmental Management Authority. I chaired the board of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies during this period of greatest expansion and development. I served as a member of the core committee of Vision 2020. I was the only person from Labor on that particular core committee. And I chaired the Labor and Social Security subcommittee of Vision 2020. I served on the Economic Development Advisory Board. I served on a committee that was reviewing 4 state enterprises during the Pandey administration. Petrotrin, Agricultural Development Bank, Caroni, and Tantique. And I submitted minority reports on both Tantique and Agricultural Development Bank. So I've done tremendous public service to Trinidad and Tobago. So I don't shirk responsibility whatsoever. Certainly don't run from it. But I will accept positions consistent with certain principles. And so I could not accept the board appointment on Petrotrin. Falsehood number 2, that the committee, the Lashley committee, was going to restructure Petrotrin in such a way that the refinery would be closed. That is a falsehood. And let me say that at no point in time was there ever a single report that recommended the closure of Petrotrin. Not the Lashley committee. I already read out one of our recommendations, governance arrangements. The second recommendation we made was organizational structure that, and I quote, to enable the executive and senior management to focus on strategic and operational responsibilities of managing profitable businesses for which they will be held accountable. We recommend A, the establishment of 3 operationally independent business units, namely Trinma, Land Exploration and Production, Refining and Marketing. And that we went on to say that the Office of the President of Petrotrin be accountable for ensuring the implementation of policy across all business units. So there was never a case of closing anything. We recommended a new organizational structure that would have made for greater efficiency, transparency, and accountability. That's what we recommended. So that was the Lashley committee. The SPNA board did hire consultants. One of them was the company Solomon Consultants, international firm that looks at refineries and how they operate and so on. Solomon never gave a recommendation for the closure of Petrotrin. SPNA, when cross-examined in the industrial court in 2018 with respect to the dispute between the union and Petrotrin over the issue of Petrotrin's failure to abide by the legally binding memorandum of agreement, SPNA admitted that Solomon never recommended the closure of Petrotrin, and neither did its other major consultant. They did not recommend that either. So there was never a single report that recommended the closure of Petrotrin. In fact, the public must be aware that in January of 2018, the company board met with the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, and I want to get the exact quotation, met with the Joint Select Committee of Parliament on energy matters. And the board of Petrotrin, this is January 2018, indicated that to the Parliament that it was actually very optimistic about the future of the company. Members of the Joint Select Committee included Minister of Finance Colin Mimber and Minister Stuart Young. Representing the company were Chairman SPNA, Director Nigel Edwards. And you could go on the Parliament website, I suppose, and find that Joint Select Committee's hearing in January of, sorry, my mistake, February, let me be accurate, February 21st, 2018. February 21st, 2018. The Petrotrin board meets with the Joint Select Committee of Parliament on Energy Matters. And the Petrotrin board says that between 2013 and 2017, the company generated free cash flows, that is before taxes and so on, of $270 million US, or $1.8 billion. And that its plan that the board came up with will enable the company to generate $1.2 billion US in free cash flows between 2018 and 2022, and that this would enable them to service its debt and so on. So in February 2018, the board of Petrotrin was not considering any closure, but had identified a way forward for the company to return to full profitability. Let me make the point as well that between 2013 and 2018, and 2016 rather, Petrotrin actually contributed a very significant amount, the second largest amount of tax revenue for the government of Trinidad and Tobago. So that it is not true that Petrotrin was a ward of the state and that Petrotrin was sucking money out of the hands of taxpayers and that Petrotrin was being carried by taxpayers. The fact of the matter is that Petrotrin had contributed very substantial amounts of money to taxpayers over a period of many years, which taxes benefited all the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. That we want to debunk that. If you don't believe me, you just have to look, and I invite the media to do its own research. Just look at the annual reports of the Trinidad and Tobago Extractive Industries process, that body, which is an independent body. Trinidad and Tobago Extractive Industries have reported information on the taxes collected by the government for each oil company. And you could see that Petrotrin between 2013 and 2016 contributed the second largest quantum of taxes to Trinidad and Tobago. It is true, however, that in part of 2016 and 17 and 18, that Petrotrin was not able to pay its taxes to the government, but it was paying all of its debts. And it was not only paying all of its debts, but its activities earned foreign exchange for Trinidad and Tobago, and it also made major contributions to the economy through business activity, particularly in the South. So we just wanted to set some of those records right. As late as the middle of August 2018, and this information came out when Espinay was cross-examined and giving his evidence before the industrial court on the same OBQ Petrotrin dispute. Espinay gave evidence that up until early August, it was pursuing a policy of restructuring that did not involve any closure of the refinery. In fact, Petrotrin had hired 2 expatriates, one to take over the management, executive management of Trinma and the land operations of Petrotrin, and secondly, another expat to take over the executive management of the refinery and marketing operations of Petrotrin, including the management of the port and the tank farm and all of that. So up until early August 2018, the company hired people. In fact, the industrial court was given evidence of email exchanges between Petrotrin and this individual who had been hired to run the refinery, to manage rather the refinery. where he was asking about his housing and other arrangements and so on. So up until early August 2018, there was no decision to close the refinery and to retrench all of the workers, because there was no report, there was no study that recommended to the board any such closure. There was no such report. What happened was that there were three PowerPoint slides, which a decision was made to shut down the refinery, send home all the workers. 3 PowerPoint slides. And when Espinay was invited to indicate who made the decision on the cross-examination in the industrial court, he could not say who made the decision. He did not say the board made the decision. He did not say the cabinet made the decision. He did not say the energy subcommittee of cabinet made the decision. He could not say who made the decision. All he said was the numbers made the decision. The numbers, that's all he said. The numbers made the decision. No people made the decision. So there was never a recommendation for the closure of the company. So that deals with falsehood number 2, that the restructuring would have meant the closure of the refinery. There was no such decision to restructure, to close the refinery based on a report. None. Let me also say that even assuming that the company wanted, or the cabinet wanted, or prime minister wanted, whoever, to close the refinery, why were all the workers of Petrotrin sent home? According to Espinay, all. Why send home all the workers at Trinma and the production workers in Santa Flora and in Pinal and in Forest Reserve and so on? Why send home all of those workers? And the answer came out in a panel discussion that was held, at which I was on which I was a member, and also Espinay was a member, when Mr. Espinay said in response to me that they wanted to get rid of the collective agreements. And the only way they could get rid of the collective agreements was by getting rid of all the workers, so that the Oilfields Workers Trade Union will no longer be present as the recognized majority union. And so they could get rid of the collective agreements. And therefore they get rid of medical plan, pension plan, terms and conditions of employment, and so on. That is what they wanted to get rid of. Because they could have restructured if they wanted only to close the refinery by continuing Petrotrin as a company, shutting down part of that company, namely the refinery, assuming that's what they wanted to do, and leave everything else running as it is, and discuss with the union, as they had committed to do by way of a memorandum of agreement, but which they failed to do, and they were fined by the industrial court for their failure to do so. By violating a legally binding agreement, they could have discussed with the union, in furtherance of the memorandum of agreement, how the company could have been restructured to reduce labor costs. But they didn't want to do that. And I'll come back to that when I discuss the falsehood about the PNM and labor. Falsehood number 3 has to do with the issue of Standards and Poor's downgrade. The Prime Minister, in an effort to get away from, or to have you not focus on the fact that Standards and Poor's downgraded Petrotrin recently based upon the Petrotrin Petroleum Holding Companies of Trinidad and Tobago, which is the holding company under which you have Legacy Petrotrin, you have Guaracara, which owns the refinery assets, Paria, which owns the tank farm and the port at Point-a-Pierre, and Heritage, which is responsible for oil production offshore and onshore. So the company was downgraded, and they want to duck and run from that fact, but that's a fact. So how are they trying to shift the narrative? Because that is what they're trying to do, shift the narrative with the falsehood about if they didn't do what they did in 2018 by sending home all the workers, all the contractors who used to do business at Petrotrin lost their jobs too, companies went out of business and so on. And the refinery was shut down, that we would have been downgraded as a country. That is a falsehood, Dr. Rowley. Falsehood. I gave evidence before the industrial court in the dispute between Petrotrin and the ODQ in 2018. I gave evidence. This is my witness statement. Yes, this is my witness statement. And I went on oath in the industrial court. And my focus was from paragraph 13 of my witness statement. The first 12 paragraphs were simply saying what I have done, what is my employment, what was my employment, and so on. Some of the committees that I served on. But from paragraph 13 onwards to paragraph 35, which is the end of my affidavit statement, I spoke about the issue of ratings agencies. And I debunked the falsehood that the government was peddling at the time, that if they didn't shut down the company the way they did, the country would have been downgraded, and if we got downgraded, then our loan would be in trouble, and we couldn't borrow, and we would have to pay more interest on our debts. And then as a result of that, hospitals couldn't get medicine, and schools wouldn't get supplies. Remember, all of that was being peddled by the government, absolute falsehoods. But those were being peddled in order to try and get the public on the side of the government in its decision to shut down the whole Petrotrin, retrench all the workers, and of course keep the refinery closed. I went on evidence. And not only did I go on evidence, in my evidence, I submitted statements by the Minister of Energy, Minister of Finance, because he was unhappy with the fact that prior to 2018, way back in 2017, that Standards & Poor's and Moody's were downgrading Trinidad and Tobago long before the Petrotrin shut down in 2018. In 2017, Standards & Poor's and Moody's had downgraded, and Minister of Finance says, you know what, we're going to go for a third rating agency, Fitch, because we can't trust Standards & Poor's and Moody's. And in fact, they did go out and contract Fitch and other ratings agencies. And I put out statements in August of 2018, where the Minister of Finance issued a press release saying that they got Fitch's ratings and so on, and they were happy. August 7th, 2018, right? Which is just around the time they took the decision to close down Petrotrin. So up to then, they were bubbling, no reference to Petrotrin and the problems of Petrotrin on this press release of August 7th, 2018, and so on. So, and then I quoted, I attached statements by Moody's, by S&P's, and so on the ratings where they refer to Petrotrin. And at no time did they say that the situation at Petrotrin would have caused a downgrade of the entire country. I went on evidence. And in fact, based upon my evidence, it was shown that the evidence of Vishnu Danpal, then Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, that his evidence was false, that he was misleading the country. And in fact, the union's attorney, senior counsel, had to say to Mr. Danpal, who was in the witness box, that he, Danpal, had misled the industrial court and the appeal court on the issue of the relationship between the ratings agencies and Trinidad and Tobago. Danpal, in other words, lied. And my evidence, I was cross-examined by senior counsel for Petrotrin, Reginald Amor, senior counsel for the Attorney General, because the Attorney General also got enjoined in this matter, Mr. Sriram Jairam, and none of those senior counsels could shake or discredit the evidence I gave, which said that the country was not in danger of a downgrade because of the operations of Petrotrin. Yet the Prime Minister came back with that falsehood again on Saturday, trying to hide the fact that 3.5 years after the closure of Petrotrin, all the workers gone home, ODBQ out of Petrotrin and so on, that heritage is downgraded. So who are you going to blame for that? Who are you going to blame for that, Prime Minister? Who are you going to blame for that? But Dan Paul was richly rewarded by giving evidence and making those statements, which turned out to be misleading, as shown in the industrial court when he was under oath. He was rewarded by a diplomatic posting after he retired as permanent secretary. So he's now High Commissioner, I believe, to London for Trinidad and Tobago. So that was falsehood number 3. Falsehood number 4, that the losses of Petrotrin, let me deal with the losses of Petrotrin. Petrotrin, even up to its management accounts of August 2018, which I have, Petrotrin was actually generating a profit on its operations, including the refinery. So what was the problem? The problem was not that the company could not generate a profit out of its operations. The problem was the debt that Petrotrin had, which it was servicing. But when you took out the amount of money that it had to pay its debt, then obviously as out of its profits, then it left the company in a situation where for 2017, 2018, it could not pay its taxes to the government. At the same time, the government was not paying to Petrotrin the subsidy on fuel for LPG, gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, because Petrotrin sold those items to NP at market prices, but the consumers would get it at a subsidized price. The government was then responsible for giving NP the difference between the market price and the subsidized price so that NP could pay that to Petrotrin, but Petrotrin never received that, not only when it wasn't paying taxes, but for years. So government was owing Petrotrin, Petrotrin was owing government. When we looked at the net, Petrotrin actually owed government a bit more, somewhat more than what government owed Petrotrin. But don't say that the government subsidized Petrotrin, because not a cent of taxpayers' money was actually put into Petrotrin. Not a cent of taxpayers. You never see in the budget line item transfers and subsidies, money going to Petrotrin. You never see that at all. So when they say that Petrotrin was a ward of the state and money, instead of money going to hospitals and schools, money was going to Petrotrin, not true. That was a falsehood. But there was a debt, big debt, incurred by Petrotrin in US dollars. And part of that debt was to build an ultra-low sulfur diesel plant so that more sulfur could be taken out of the diesel fuel that was being produced in the refinery, so that when cars burn the diesel, there'll be less pollution because we're dealing with an environmental issue, and there will be less damage to cars that use diesel. And the international market was going to require diesel that had very low sulfur content. So that was one major plan. Another major plan was one that was to convert natural gas into diesel and other fuels, what is called gas to liquids plant. Those two plants have never been started up. Up to now, the ultra-low sulfur diesel plant, which cost this country $300+ million US dollars, has never been started, has not produced a drop of ultra-low sulfur diesel. Why? Because those who designed it and those who built it did so under specifications that did not meet earthquake standards, given that Trinidad and Tobago is in a major earthquake zone. And so you have to build these plants to a certain standard that if there's a major earthquake, they will not crack apart and explode. This plant was not built to the required earthquake standards. And to do that would take another 150 to 200 million US dollars. Now, when the Prime Minister started calling labor leaders dotish and was being very disrespectful, we could say to him, who made the dotish decision to go ahead and have constructed a plant costing 300 plus million US dollars that has never functioned because somebody made a dotish mistake to design it and build it not up to earthquake specifications? Who made the dotish decisions? Who oversaw the dotish implementation of a dotish decision? Prime Minister, you wouldn't speak about that. Who made the dotish decision to bring an old refinery plant out of Central America, put it up in Pointe-a-Pierre, retrofit it at great expense to Petrotrin, and it has never produced a single drop of liquid fuels? That gas to liquids project, which was abandoned by Petrotrin and then sold to Nikon, and then when Nikon tried to start it up in 2021, it exploded. Who made the dotish decision to try to go with a gas to liquids plant and bring in an old refinery plant to do that? Who made those dotish decisions? Which was the board in place that made those dotish decisions? Which government, which cabinet was in charge of the country when those dotish decisions were made? Which cost Petrotrin $1.5 billion US dollars. Yes, $1.5 billion US dollars. And which loans, when you count principal and interest, $1.5 billion US dollars, which is what caused Petrotrin to be in difficulty, and which loans are still outstanding, which is why Heritage and Trinidad Petroleum Holdings was downgraded the other day. Those loans that were made were taken out way back when to do these dotish things of ultra-low sulfur diesel plant, not up to earthquake specifications, gas to liquids plant with an old refinery plant brought in from Central America. Those loans are what is still on the books of Trinidad Petroleum Holdings Limited because they were refinanced by the SPNA board in 2019. They were refinanced in 2019. Or in 2019, they were refinanced in 2019, or in 2018, sorry. In 2018, they were refinanced. So, who made those dotish decisions? You don't want to take responsibility for that, Dr. Rowley, when it was a Malcolm Jones executive chairman-led board that made those decisions that would have gone to the Energy Subcommittee of Cabinet, chaired by deceased Prime Minister Patrick Manning, and members of the cabinet who made those, who might have approved those decisions, or certainly would have had responsibility as cabinet for the decisions of this major state company borrowing all of this money. You were a member of that cabinet at the time, as was Coleman Bell, as was Camille Robinson-Regis. At least 3 senior members now in this government were part of the cabinet at the time when those decisions were made by the executive, by the board of Petrotrin. So who really is dotish in Trinidad and Tobago? So when you point one finger one direction, remember one is pointed back at you, Dr. Rowley. So I dealt with that issue because we must never forget that those loans to do projects that have not generated a cent in revenue, which revenue would have been able to pay back the loans. That is what caused Petrotrin not to be able to pay its taxes in 17 and 18, but it was servicing all of its loans. And it certainly did not justify the closure of the refinery because the refinery was actually operating at and generating a profit And we have management accounts or performance report for the refinery of April. We have the management accounts of the company for August and other documentation to prove our point. Let me deal with the last point now. Falsehood number 4, that the PNM is pro-labor. Let me say categorically, and I was in the labor movement for very many years, and I've studied and researched the history of the labor movement as well, that having a senator or 2 or 3 or 4 does not make you a pro-labor government. And therefore, you have to look at the history of the decisions that a government made to see whether you are pro-labor or anti-labor. 1963, PNM government under Eric Williams, 1 year after independence, establishes the Mbanifold Commission of Inquiry into subversive activities in the trade union movement, essentially trying to attack George Weeks in the OWQ, Joe Young in the Transport and Industrial Workers Union, and 1 or 2 other labor leaders, and also attacking the advisors to these unions, people like Lennox Spear and Jack Kelshaw and others, seeking to create a communist bogey in Trinidad and Tobago. And so you set up this commission of inquiry known as the Mbanifold Commission of Inquiry, named after the West African person who chaired that commission of inquiry. That report was laid in Parliament in 1965, March of 1965, when the Industrial Stabilization Act was laid in Parliament and passed through the House in 1 sitting, passed through the Senate in 1 sitting, and immediately signed into law by then Governor General Ho Choi, Sir Solomon Ho Choi. So, 1965, the Industrial Stabilization Act banned all strikes by unions. It attacked trade union rights fundamentally, took away the right of workers to withhold their labor, and so on. So it was anti-labor, very much anti-labor. 1970, trade union leaders during state of emergency, Black Power protests and so on, trade union leaders like George Weeks and Clive Nunes are detained. 1971, late 1970, a second state of emergency is declared, rather than late 1971. Second state of emergency is declared November 1971, which runs until June of 1972. George Weeks, Nuevo Diaz, Alan Campbell from here in Marbella, Brother Scobie passed away last year. They were detained. Clive Nunes, Jack Kelshaw, the OWQ's legal advisor, detained. Why was this second state of emergency declared? Because the Trinidad and Tobago Labour Congress, led by your PNM people, Dr. Rowley, you call some of their names and so on, they put out a full-page ad in the newspapers saying that if the government did not take action to stop workers leaving their unions like Seamen and Waterfront, like the Communication Workers Union led by Carl Tull at the time, and WASA led by Critchlow, if the government didn't stop workers who wanted to leave those workplaces and join the OWQ, because OWQ was a union that workers saw as best representing their interests, then the Labour Congress would take strike action, have a general strike. So the Labour Congress demanded that the government do something to prevent workers having the right to join a trade union of their choice, frustrating the rights of workers, which is one of the fundamental rights of the International Labour Organization, freedom of association. The Labour Congress, PNM leaders, in collaboration with PNM government, said they would have a general strike if the government didn't take action. As a result of that, the Industrial Relations Act was passed, which prevents one union from representing more than one category of an essential industry in Trinidad and Tobago. So union leaders who are party members, 1965, when the ISA was being debated in Parliament, Carl Tull and others led workers to attack George Weeks and other union leaders outside the Parliament. So you had PNM labor leaders attacking other labor leaders, even though Weeks and others were defending the rights of workers. Tull was defending his party over the interests of his union, and of the workers of this country. That is what your PNM history is, Dr. Rowley, but you don't know that history. You don't know it, but it is a falsehood to say that the PNM is pro-labor. And as for your administration, you are pursuing aggressively what we call neoliberal policies, which policies mean, in short, giving capital free rein while you constrain and rein in workers and unions. So you get rid of ODBQ in the oil industry by how you did the closure of Petrotrin. You get rid of collective agreements and so on. You want to do the same at TSTT. You did the same with the tourism development company where CWU was. You want to do the same at the port with your restructuring and WASA. You want to get rid of unions. And all over the world where this happens, those who benefit are the owners and managers of big capital. You, Dr. Rowley, represent the interests of big capital, local capital and foreign capital in Trinidad and Tobago as you pursue your new liberal policies and which are against the interests of workers and are anti-labor. And I say that without fear of contradiction. And so that is falsehood number 5. PNM is not pro-labor. I want to thank you for listening to this very important statement as we have responded to all of the falsehoods expressed by Dr. Rowley. Falsehood number 1, that I ran from responsibility, not true. Falsehood number 2, that the restructuring that was being contemplated in 2017 when we submitted our last report was going to result in harsh decisions like sending home workers. That was not true. There was never a single report. And up until August, early August, even the SPNA board was looking at hiring, had hired people to continue the operations of Petrotrin and so on. And they had to pay one of them big compensation because he would have left a job to take up the one here, and then there was no more job 2 weeks afterwards. Falsehood number 3, that the country would have been downgraded if something wasn't done at Petrotrin. I gave evidence on that, which was never contradicted under cross-examination in the court. On the other hand, the evidence of Dan Paul was shown to be misleading on that issue. Falsehood number 4, with respect to losses and so on. Petrotrin was generating an operating profit. Its problem was its debt. And if you're talking about debt, you have to identify the dotage decisions that were made and ask who made those decisions and take responsibility for that, Dr. Rowley, because you were part of the cabinet when the decisions were made by the board, which you had a part in appointing at the time. Falsehood number 5, that the PNM is pro-labor. Thank you very much.